Ladies and gentlemen, it's another episode of Prototype, and I'm me. So, what's going on, guys? Hope you guys are having a lovely day. I am actually testing out a quick and easy version of encoding this instead of having to deal with it in post. So, yeah, should be if I can do this more often, then I can do these more often, and I don't have to worry about rendering them afterwards, which is a big upgrade, I think. So, it is, of course, 11:43 in the morning of Wednesday, the 19th of April, 2023. A couple days ago, we had another birthday. We had Roller Skates' birthday on the 17th, and he had a smoochy birthday present. So, isn't that lovely? Now, that being said, of course, I have just noticed that the screenshot I took earlier for the episode here has a very obvious terrain bug in it. So now you can never unsee that too. That's my gift to you. We're actually going to be talking about factions. This is a screenshot of a map that I was just playing around with for the sake of the screenshot, to be honest. But it's a scenario map that I had never really finished, even though it has like full voice acting and stuff. And while I was thinking about it, it has a pre-placed aspirant for you. And yesterday I was doing some streaming and I messed around with potential faction system and getting implementation in and all that stuff. And it actually turned out to be pretty okay, I think. It's definitely interesting. It's definitely different. But one of the things that I like about the situation that we have here is that in theory it would allow me to explore like riffs on different parts of what makes a specific race that race and how could you be meaningfully distinct with only a few unit changes and stuff. So that's obviously stuff that we'll talk about here. And I hope to also broach the subject on the forthcoming episode of Crow's Nest, which is going to be recording later today, most likely. At worst, it'll be recording the day after, but we'll see. So, yeah, we'll obviously answer the coffee questions as usual. If you want to support this enterprise, this fraudulent fiasco of a company, then you can do so by donating to us through that link, which is in the description, of course. But beyond that, I was thinking, actually, I should probably start taking questions for this as well, just in case people have stuff that they want answered here, but sometimes it's nice to have Veek's input on the subject as well. So for now we're just doing that, but there's many format changes that could show up differently or whatever. I mean, maybe if you're one of them heavy hitter donors like Luciferius, maybe you can just commission an episode itself, and the whole episode could be about that subject or whatever. That could, if the subject is worth really looking into and talking about, then that could easily become a thing. So. Let's, of course, talk about getting factional. Let's, of course, talk about factions in this episode. I guess on the outset, right, the initial point that I have about campaigns and about single-player content, to me, the important thing is that they are competitive, that they compete for your time, that they expect you to play well and improve and engage with the RTS concepts, the core concepts of playing a real-time strategy game. And if they don't do that, if they don't succeed in really trying to, just force you to demonstrate that you know how to play the game, demonstrate competence. If they can't do that for you, then they're kind of failing. Even if you're a really, really good player, you still have to play the RTS. You have to go through the motions of, expanding, teching up, doing certain tactics and stuff. Cheese notwithstanding, there's all these elements that make you think, hey, this should definitely work, or this should definitely, not work, depending on what the strategy is and the composition and who you're facing off against and what your opponents are and stuff. And so, yeah, there should be, challenge. There should be missions where you have to play a few times and fail a few times in order to finally succeed, especially depending on your own personal skill, right? And in fact, entirely dependent on your own personal skill in many ways. Although how that skill gets expressed and, what your strengths and weaknesses are, surely you might not fall until middle of the campaign or later in the campaign because of the certain different skills, like working different certain play styles obviously match up differently. If you're a very conservative player and you get rushed, well, maybe you can handle it because you didn't do something more volatile in the early game. Meanwhile, if you get contained or something because you're not being super focused and not being super proactive, then that can obviously lead in the opposite direction. You can lose because of that. It'll just be a little bit of a slower loss in that sense. It's more of a bleeding out situation, basically, where you're suffocated by the opponent. So that can all happen, and that's all very interesting and deep, and we instantly start talking about, like, interaction concepts and these things where individuals are doing things on the map, and that's leading to the outcome and stuff, instead of obviously just like spawning the stuff in or having a bunch of pre-play shit or whatever, and just expecting that the player will grind through it instead of actually engaging with the game. So anyhow, that is of course a main focal point of my concept for any content that happens to include AI or whatever. And so that could be single player, cooperative, some kind of wacky scenario where there's PvP and PvAI in the same time or whatever. But the point is that the content should be engaging. That would be the ideal thing. And you can't really have engagement without challenge. It's just kind of like the whole point is that you have to stimulate the parts of our monkey brains that decide we want to improve at something. And so we only need to improve if we can't win outright from the get-go. So that means that we have to go up against an opponent who's somewhat competent. And that's a big deal too. So the reason I preface talking about factions with this is because it segues into a very important point about how the content is designed. Now, I have been criticized by some people who are very much into like the StarCraft 2 camp of, oh yeah, the races should be completely different or whatever. Like it doesn't matter if they're completely different. You can have the, like 30 new units in the race and like a bunch of stuff that works completely differently and whatever. And that's fine. And, okay, well, if you're going to make that argument, if you're going to say that kind of thing, if you're going to do that kind of thing, then that is one angle that you can take. And that's one thing that we've seen explored, although maybe not super competently, because obviously all the default campaigns are pretty bad. But the reason I bring that case up is it's actually counter to how I really feel about things. I think, you do want an element of parity between single player and multiplayer. At the very least, you need to make sure that there's challenge and that the challenge is expressed in similar ways, if not the same ways. And by that, I mean, you need an opponent who is skilled enough to test the mettle of the player. Otherwise, why would the player be doing that, right? So that's sort of how I approach it. Some people look to games for, dumb relaxation at the end of a day. They're just trying to like play something simple and basic, and they don't really care too much about if it's challenging. And to those people, I say, well, there's plenty of games within the current sphere that serve your needs, that serve your desires. But I also propose that maybe you would actually appreciate games a little bit better if they did challenge you, if they did throw a spanner in the works and say, actually, you got to think about this problem. You got to, execute well on this strategy, and you got to, be mechanically gifted enough to, execute on it or whatever. Like, you got to pay attention and you got to put the effort in. I think even people who are at the end of a long day, even people who are maybe, if you push came to shove, they would be like, all right, let me just play this stupid game, right? Like, let me just like waste my time basically, because they're just trying to unwind. I think even those people would still appreciate being able to lose themselves in a deep sort of engagement with an enemy that actually is thinking and actually is trying to defeat them. And that's why actually a lot of people will play multiplayer games when they come home from work. That's why a lot of people will do that. So even if they're doing cooperative stuff, you would think that, hey, they would need to cooperate. They need to skillfully, play with each other in order to find success. And this is sort of where I'm like not so subtly subtweeting the StarCraft 2 co-op angle where, like, yeah, in theory you've got to cooperate, but not really. I mean, you can just exist on the map and you probably win. So it's not too difficult in that particular respect. It's all spawned in. It's all very, as Mesk would call it, academic. Although I'm not even sure how much he's seen of that. I think he's just stayed super clear away from that particular one, but it's pretty bad. It's all the like, oh, here's the fake leveling up. And we talked about this in the last episode of Crow's Nest, actually. I made the not so bold, because it's very obvious now, claim that any sort of leveling system or grinding, like in that sort of sense, any progression system, they all use the language of self-improvement, but they're all fake. They're all forced. So it's like, here's this stand-in for actually getting better at the game. You earn new skills. You learn new skills in the game. the thing that you do to upgrade is called learn, and the thing that you're learning is a skill. And it's like, wow, we're so close. But instead of it actually being a skill, it's like, nah, it's just, this new trait that I have, right? So that's in RPGs all over the place. And then, oh, I guess I reached the maximum level. I'm at the top. It's like that's in StarCraft 2 co-op. And then your prestige equivalent or whatever, where you're going above the maximum level, is just like increasing stats or whatever. I forget what the term they use for that, but it's like, it's all of this language is like very clearly communicating to you that you are not fully understanding like the ramifications of what you're saying, like you're kind of there. Like, you recognize that gaming is about progression, that like real challenge is where the rubber meets the road there, but you're not really delivering on it. Right. And so Now we come back to factions. We think about this in those terms. At the goal of any of the content that I release, single player, whatever, that includes an AI component, is not to really be that different from multiplayer, because what I really want is for both like a good multiplayer match, a satisfying multiplayer match. If we think about what that is, you don't just pick up, an opponent who you're just going to trounce every single game. This is where Meska is obviously going to just call me out for playing against him. But the point is more so to say that, like, I wouldn't want to sit there and be like, hey, let me if I really never was in danger of losing to Mask, then I would definitely not be as interested in playing him as I am, because I think he actually can. He gives himself a little bit too few credits here, because I think he can actually be dangerous. He's actually improved quite a bit, especially with like micromanagement and stuff. Probably helps that he can click on units a little bit more accurately since Veek added a little bit more support for CNC draw, and like found that works out a bit better for some people's setups than the default windowed mode. And all of that stuff, right? So like he's upgraded his setup a little bit, but he's also just gotten better and more familiar with how things work. And so I don't think, he gives himself enough credit in that particular case. But okay, yeah. So say you have this recently Lundier, I think is how you would pronounce his name. And, it sounds French, even though he's it's London is what I think of, that's a little bit weird. I'll reuse that joke in the cast over I do later. But the suspiciously French man is he played his first game and he was like, oh yeah, I'm just this I'm like wood tier or whatever, and the Shambler is actually pretty established in the game, so I just lost horribly and everything was horrible. And like, okay, well, if you feel that way, if that were actually true, which maybe it is, maybe it isn't, I suspect that's not the case, but we'll see when we get into the cast over, then you wouldn't want a player who you were so far above, just like you wouldn't want to play against somebody you were so far below. I mean, if you do, okay, well, there's like some opportunity for you to improve, but if you just get ground into the dirt all the time, then that's not going to be super useful and conducive to actual improvement, right? You're so far behind that you don't really know how to comprehend a path to improvement necessarily that would get you on that level. You need to set your goals a little bit closer to home and then climb the ladder that way, right? I mean, even if we think about ranked ladders and what they mean in video games, yeah, you're climbing the ladder, bro. Like, that's how it works. So anyway, all that said, it feels to me like a lot of people don't recognize that, like, yeah, if your opponent is kind of brain dead and they're just sort of like, maybe even if they have advantages, like in the case of a single player campaign, they have a bunch of pre-play stuff where they get spawned in waves or whatever. They're not using it to any degree. They're not capitalizing upon it. You're winning because they're making a mistake fundamentally. And their mistake is not using the advantages that they have. And that's a big deal. That's like actually a huge issue that really sets it, puts it to rest, I think, in my mind, like the way that I try to evaluate content. The goal of it is always to be competitive. The goal of it is always to give you, at least this sandbox in which you must prove that you are competent. Even if you are without, beyond a shadow of a doubt, like outclassing the AI opponent in terms of playing the game. The game itself shouldn't end in, 3 or 4 minutes just because you happen to be a pretty big, have a pretty big skill difference. And if the enemy is still trying to do stuff, if they're still trying to play the game, expanding, attacking, maybe doing some harassment, containing in the future when we can actually do that with AI and stuff, like, that is all the components that I need to make sure that even good players are forced to prove that they are good on a daily basis every single time they boot up one of these campaign missions or one of these scenario missions, one of the co-op maps or whatever. Like, all of that is always the case. You must play well in order to find victory. Even if that victory ends up coming relatively easily, you still had to prove that you had the necessary ingredients to form that recipe to actually get victory. And when you consider it from that perspective, now start thinking about how underserved most of the content actually is. Most of the people who play these single player campaigns actually are, by and large, like in general. We have to consider the idea that if we do introduce something that is exclusive to the single player experience or the co-op versus AI experience, and of course I'm talking in this particular case about factions, that we might be driving a wedge between the competitive players and the conventional players. Because in this particular case, we're dealing with adding new units or replacing units or whatever. And as a result of that change, it does mean that you are in a rough spot for map knowledge, for game knowledge, right? For understanding your composition and how things work and all of that stuff. So I certainly agree that there is some cost to the approach that I am undertaking, wherein players will have to form some understanding of how these units work, and these units won't actually manifest in competitive. At least if we take that for granted for now and say, okay, the faction system doesn't exist in competitive. All of these units are going to be versus AI only, in whatever case they are, like co-op or single player or whatever. If that's the premise that we're operating within, if that's what we are defaulting, as that's the default assumption, then let's consider like what that actually does to the game. It does mean that competitive players basically have less of an information burden in that particular respect. More things are generally simplified. We think about maps. Usually they're symmetrical. If they're asymmetric in some way, it's usually an unavoidable like issue or error or shortcoming of the editing software, or just the fact that it's an isometric perspective game or something to that effect, right? And in general, no matter where you spawn, even if there are some differences, you're going to have a similar chance of success in any matchup. Like that's the ideal benchmark of a well-balanced map that is existing, within a well-balanced game. So we think about all of that stuff and we consider to ourselves, okay, like this is the situation we find ourselves in. This is where we're at with competitive gaming in an RTS environment. So the maps are like these unique battlegrounds, very occasional balance changes and stuff like that. These are the only things you really have to think about is in an ideal world, we don't have to balance the game all the time. We don't have to, do sweeping systemic changes the way that obviously we've been doing in CMW. Like that's because we're exploring, experimenting, doing all of these cool, wacky things just for the sake of trying to figure out, what's good, what's a good formula to follow, what's what are some good assumptions to test, and then like are there replacements we can do in the future and stuff. And actually I talked with Pr0totype about this at the end of the last stream, talking about how broadly speaking, like a meta topic is, if you're trying to find solutions to design problems or to balancing problems or whatever, then really just start exploring, just like start thinking as if a particular solution that was proposed was actually enacted. What would be the second and third order consequences in, as best as you can envision them? Like, what would be some potential results? And if you like some of those potential results on paper, then how can you make sure that like any negative traits get minimized in the implementation, or how can you maximize what is good about that and all of this other stuff? And so, yeah, we think about that in a meta context, but we obviously think about it in this very specific context. Okay, you have the meta of the competitive play, and it would be meaningfully different if there were factional units than the meta of the single player or the co-op, because I mean, obviously the AI itself behaves differently than a human player. So there's already a pretty big distinction in that, even though we obviously want the AI to be very distinct and very powerful. So we don't want them to be pushovers, but we definitely aren't going to achieve the same level of as an adaptive human with a very specific style. Some things will be represented better than others. I imagine like any sort of containment play and stuff like that will be actually quite hard to implement initially. But when we do get it done, it could be very interesting. Maybe there will be some, exploit cases where you can abuse the AI in some way, but ideally nothing that would result in it totally falling apart and not being successful in any capacity, right? Like we definitely want the AI to be successful. We want the AI to be, at the very least, like, again, give each player a bit of a, like I always call it the shit test, but you can just say litmus test, like an acid test. Like can the player play an RTS well? If they can, and depending on how good we, like what the level of quality achieved by the word well is here, it's doing a lot of heavy lifting, then okay, you should have at least a chance against the AI, right? That's the idea. So, but they do operate different than a human. So you already have a very different experience, even if the tech trees are exactly identical. We're assuming no cheating here. We're assuming the AI needs to scout, and we're also assuming the AI can adapt to some degree. Like if they see air structures, like a star pad equivalent or whatever, then they'll start building some anti-air defenses. And so we consider all of those things. We consider, like, again, what the meta looks like in competitive, and can we adapt some format of that to single player? But obviously AI can excel at different tools and maybe struggle with other tools. So that's good. That execution is going to be very different for them. And obviously all of our maps are non-standard, right? So the environments themselves are going to be very different. That's going to contribute to a very different meta as well, because we're basically saying, hey, here's the tools that you're used to, but in an environment that you're not used to. And this environment itself provides you with different tools. If we think about the terrain advantage, and we think about the general positioning of pathways and how wide or small they are. And like, we're going to break a lot of standardized conventions when we go into single player campaigns and cooperative versus AI content and all this other stuff. That being said, if we start to mess and muddy with the tech trees, that's going to be very different. So let's talk about how I would like to do that within CMBW. I would like to riff on the races, riff on the designs that we already have. And by that, I mean, we're not going to be totally reshaping the entire game and adding like an entire subfaction that's basically the same size as a default race or whatever. What we're talking about is somewhere between 2 and 4, maybe pushing it max 6 new units which replace existing options. And so one example could be, and I say could because I don't know, that cohorts replace Cyprians on the barracks for the Nidus Trinity. One replacement that I definitely know is going to happen is that the entire Scrapyard add-on line is going to be removed for the Golden Republic, and they will be getting a chapter house structure that is added on to the Fulcrum. And that structure will allow the training of aspirants and some other unit that I have not yet decided. That is an example of we're making the same unit roster, right, in terms of size, but we are taking one kind of unit and we are replacing it. I mean, at the same time, the aspirant's role might be a little bit more analogous to the Goliath, and so we might have to think about like, okay, what if we just replace the Goliath instead? So this is a different angle, right? And we have to start thinking about how these sort of systems would interact. And what does it mean if you have a unit that is very different? If you replace the Cyprian, which is the tried and true sort of like backline mid to longish range Terran infantry unit that deals with crowds, with a much shorter ranged unit that's like, got 4 range, so actually less than the Maverick. And then we think about here's a unit that shoots fairly low DPS attacks, but is much more durable and scales super well with healing. Like, what are these kinds of concepts? If that's the concept that we go for the cohort, then okay, well, you're kind of making it so that I have a beefier front line and my infantry squads last longer, but now the Maverick becomes the main damage dealer, actually. And that becomes very, very different. It also forces your clerics to be a little bit further to the front line instead of the back line, which maybe allows you and incentivizes you to use Hurricanes more often because they're already in that area, or Shamans, of course, if you're using those instead. And so these are all very interesting potential permutations where you can accomplish different things and not accomplish different other things because of this tool being changed. Like, now you want Mavericks in the bunkers most of the time because the range of the cohort is not going to be the best compared to the Cyprian, obviously. And so that's going to change the defensive game a lot, right? And so anyway, you can sort of see what I'm after here, where a couple of units in a few different spots end up getting subbed out for other faction-based units, faction-specific units. Like, obviously the everybody and their mother would be like, "Oh, dude, the biggest thing you got to do is replace the Phalanx with the Tarrasque for Nidus Trinity." Well, I don't know if that's actually going to happen. I mean, it's mostly because of the lack of assets that we use the siege tank base graphic for the Tarrasque in the first place. It's supposed to be very different. And it also kind of does, it's more analogous to the Madrigal, I guess, with its multi-target secondary weapon. And like the fact that it fire while moving is just like a stand-in for being mobile. So the Madrigal is very mobile. So it would be a little bit weird if you replace the Phalanx, but not the Madrigal, because then the Madrigal has the same kind of thing. So not sure about that one. But yeah, these are all thoughts that I have, right? Like, do we go the add-on route for Terrans and just like replace entire lines of certain tech? Or do we, just replace a couple of units here and there, like sort of the Cyprian to cohort or Goliath to aspirant example? Like, these are all different ways that you could do it. So what I've made clear here is that the implementation, the exact execution of this system is not yet determined. But what I would like to do is exactly what I described. I would like to riff. I would like to make players have to consider, okay, I've formalized an understanding of all of these tools because I played Melee, or I've watched a lot of the castovers, or I've sort of seen the Pr0totypes, and I understand how the metagame has developed. Okay, as a result, what happens when these tools get shuffled around a little bit and when some of them are a little bit different, right? You can almost kind of think about this sort of like a precursor to how Onatar will work. Obviously, that's going to be much more granular, where certain traits are changed, and there's going to be these trade-offs that are like modifying the playstyle, but not necessarily replacing units until way later, if that happens at all. That's not 100% set in stone for the design exactly just yet. So that is pretty big. That's a pretty exciting idea. But the reason why I'm considering doing it, the reason why I'm thinking about, exploring all of these different these different elements, is it does give you the opportunity to say, okay, what's something that could actually work in theory as a tier 1 Terran infantry option, but we already have too many of those. And like, here's an example of a unit that could work, and especially replacing another unit. What does that mean? How does that change things, right? This could be pretty significant, I think, as an interesting and neat idea. I don't think it's a surprise to anybody that, you know, it would be really neat and really interesting to me to explore riffing on these ideas, because I had ideas and concepts for a lot of these units already. And if it's interesting and compelling design problem, I always get gravitated towards those. I think about it like, you know, in this particular case, Moth to a Flame style, I've already started to imagine a bunch of different potential options for different units. It's like, here's my, you know, potential for a Golden Republic, you know, spacecraft, right? Or a Nidus Trinity, you know, armor unit or whatever. And like, what could all of these mean? And how could these be implemented and all of that stuff? And it just gives you the opportunity. It's like, okay, if I'm going to consider the unit roles that currently exist, and then what would still be jiving with the Terran race as an idea, like obviously a mid-range combat unit like the Aspirant, it gels pretty well with the Terran arsenal, right? Like that's kind of analogous to how the Goliath works. So if we consider it from that perspective, it's like, okay, well, if I have these ideas for units that would in some ways maybe be too similar, or in some ways be very, very different, but just overload a roster of units. I don't want to bloat the actual roster so that you just have brand new units you train in addition. Like, that in and of itself is pretty neat, actually. And so I think, generally speaking, it's going to be really cool to see the way that the system plays out, and definitely something that I want to keep track of. But yeah, that's sort of the system, is taking a couple of units, replacing them with something that is embodying the faction thematically, and that includes in terms of like its combat roles and stuff. Like the Nidus Trinity might be, you know, using the Zerg, you know, whatever DNA stuff that they've done to be a little bit more durable, be a little bit more like ideally they would do so in some way and be swarmy or something, or you know, the idea behind the cohort that I think is very Zergy is like battle sustain. Synergizing very well with the default Terran healing. So that feels very much Terran-y. But the fact that they do so themselves and sort of like self-sustaining in the HP regen department, that's actually really interesting to me. And so definitely something that I think is worth exploring again. So all of that is interesting. You know, you think about the Aspirant, like some of these concepts might need to be tweaked anyway with the new ideas that we have, especially in terms of stats. Like they still have, obviously I haven't edited the stats for the cohort and the Aspirant to like adjust their armor and armor pen the same way that we've had the pretty big balance update, which I was planning on doing a prototype for, but didn't get around to. So I'll have to do it after tier 3 is done, which I plan to do later today and tomorrow. So you can stay tuned for that. But really the biggest thing for me is that I'm just so excited about the idea of going through and being able to take another pass, another look at some of these races, at some of these breakpoints, and think, okay, but what if like we went around the corner with some of these ideas? What if we decided, okay, instead of a backline, you know, piercing unit like a Cyprian, like what could we do with that hole once it's removed? Like if we have another combat unit in the barracks that we needed to make, and we knew we were going to remove the Cyprian in this case, but maybe, you know, maybe not. Maybe we remove the Huracan at some point or whatever. It's like, what could we do with that though? Like, we want something that interacts with the Maverick in some way where it's like, okay, you can stack these up because like one of them is, you know, longer range than the other. Well, what if we go the inverse? What if we make the cohort, you know, shorter range? And so now you can put like the line looks like, you know, Huracan, Cleric, cohort, Maverick or something to that effect, instead of, you know, Huracan, Maverick, Cleric, Cyprian, which is what the usual default looks like. Although obviously you can sustain your front line instead anyway. But these are all different ideas, all different interesting things. I think it's really cool to imagine how that would shape up over time. And beyond that, it does give you this very distinct thematic feeling of like, okay, these factions really are, you know, riffing on Terrans themselves or whatever the race is, right? Obviously, I'm focusing a lot on Terran because that's like the two quintessential options that are in most people's minds are the cohort and the Aspirant, and that's no small surprise why they show up in this particular screenshot. But I do think that it's a good idea to go through some of the critiques or complaints and stuff, and talk about how I plan to resolve them. So one of the reasons why keeping the actual roster of units low in terms of the number of changes, the reason I want to do that is actually because the whole point is to like basically make changes that are in the grand scheme of things rather subtle, where obviously they make a huge amount of difference because you're removing certain units. But the point is, Terran still feels like Terran, even if they're Golden Republic or even if they're Nidus Trinity. They still feel like Terran fundamentally. They still play in fundamentally the same way. It's just you have different tools that make very big distinctions on a micro level. But in the grand scheme of things, you're still playing like Terran. Now, you have to be kind of careful with this way of explaining it, because some people will just look at that or listen to that and they'll say, well, if there's not really much of a difference, then why have it at all? And that is a fair critique depending on how it's implemented, right? So that's something that you got to keep an eye on. Is obviously, I think it's great if we have a significant chunk of distinctions in the game between each faction, such that they do feel like different enough enemies, even though you're still facing off against Terran for most of the time, right? Or for the entirety of the time. It's just like some of those distinctions where the Golden Republic deploys this elevated tech or reclaimed tech, as it were. Meanwhile, the Nidus Trinity is going to deploy this wacky Zerg splicing, and then, the Futurist Federation has really expensive stuff that is very different that you've never seen before, and whatever. Like, all of these options are very much distinct. Like, one of the things I think for the Hekatons is that I probably resurrect the Southpaw and the Wendigo as an example of a couple of units that will end up being thrown in. And maybe they'll have Wendigos instead of Wraiths, or maybe they'll have Wendigos instead of Anseals or something. Like, that's a completely big shift or whatever. I don't even know what that would look like exactly in the current conception. I haven't even really thought too deeply about it. I just know that those two units fit the Hekatons pretty well. So, do they have Southpaws instead of Vultures? Like, do I go that insane? Or is it more like, okay, Southpaw replaces like the, something else on the Fulcrum, or even on the Mantle if I want to make it a higher tier unit or something. You never know. So there's a lot of interesting options anyway, and I think it's stuff that we should consider. We should be thinking about, like, what if we have different units that are riffing again on old unit concepts, or brand new unit concepts that riff on the old role of what came before, like the Cyprian working in conjunction with all of the other bio units, and how, okay, well, what does it mean now that it's a cohort if we go through with that plan and stuff? And it does change a lot, but what it shouldn't do is completely change the identity of the race, because then you've almost kind of made a new race, but without really doing too much. Like, they play completely differently with this particular set of additions. If they do that, then it becomes a bit corrupted, because now you actually can't fully anticipate what kinds of things you can expect. Whereas in the case of okay, these Terrans have access to these tools instead of these tools, you can still say these Terrans, like the sentence still starts there, and you can still use that as your conception, your understanding of what the Terran actually is, like what the player is actually going to be put up against and what they're going to see. I think that's a really important distinction to make, because otherwise you are going to be in an awkward spot. Otherwise you are going to have, potentially a lot of problems come out where you simply can't understand. The information burden is simply too high. But the other thing to note is that my current model for this is very much a single player or co-op versus AI experience, where, you have access to these non-standard factions within the non-standard maps and against non-human opponents. And that obviously changes the calculus quite a bit, because you are definitely going to be in a different spot in that world, in such a world. So if we think about, avoiding choice paralysis, avoiding a crazy amount of things that you have access to at the same time, that's one of the main goals of keeping the number of things small, and of course replacing instead of adding. You could maybe make the argument that why would the Futurist Federation not have access to all of the schematics for everything else? But at the same time, you can also make the argument that, well, why would they use a scrapyard? Because they're from the fucking future, dude. Like, not really, but like, that's the idea. Is like, they want to live in the future. They think of themselves as like these technocrats. They've got all the good ideas, so they don't need to use some, third rate kind of wacky like scrap drone or whatever That's not what they're interested in. They're much more concerned with using, higher tier tech and like powerful units and stuff, right? And so like for them, the Goliath would be like more like a tier 1 type unit or whatever, and like their scrapyard replacement would be the thing to utterly like completely replace. Like that would be the big ticket item for the Fulcrum, is like, holy shit, even at tier 1 these guys can deploy like powerful units or whatever, and maybe that makes a significant change or what have you. But that would be one case where, okay, now we have to think about that. Like, what does that mean for the race that such a thing has changed? There is a chance, of course, that I come up with more concepts and want to change more things. But I think when you limit yourself to, say, 2 units per tier max, you are forcing yourself to make very distinct decisions, because it does mean that things are going to be different, but it also means that enough things will stay the same that you can still anticipate most of what that army is going to do. And then you yourself have to think, okay, if based on this riff, based on the fact that there's a bit of a distinction, right? There's a new unit in this mix or whatever. What can my opponent do now that they couldn't do before? And what can't they do now that they could do before? And how can I maybe put myself into a situation to benefit from what they can't do and avoid, losing to what they can do or whatever. And I think that can lead to some really interesting and compelling gameplay that will meaningfully add distinction and flavor to certain missions and certain opponents, and help express playstyles that are supposed to be commonplace and ubiquitous among whatever faction you happen to be facing. So it can go out of hand. Like, it can change too much. It can also change not enough. But I think you can hit a Goldilocks zone where you're changing enough to make it feel distinct, feel good, and not lose yourself in the sauce, so to speak, while still maintaining the whole identity of the race, while still providing enough of a distinction that it does feel unique, but not cheap, not in a gimmicky way where it's like, oh, I guess this guy just has this thing that's super epic and I don't. Like, making it so that it feels more like, oh, there are trade-offs, there are drawbacks, right? So another thing I want out of this experience is I don't want any faction to just be head and shoulders better than the default race and that you play in Melee, but also than any other faction, because the point is that these are trade-offs. Like, the roles established by the Matador and the Blackjack, we're still kind of discovering. Obviously, the Matador specifically got heavily rejigged recently. If we did add a new add-on to the Fulcrum for one of the subfactions, and we made it such that the Matador and Blackjack were not in the game for them, or we at least removed the Blackjack, especially because considering it's literally made out of scrap, definitely doesn't fit the Futurist Federation. If we were going to go that route, okay, what does that mean though? Like, what are they losing when they lose the Blackjack? And what are they gaining when they gain whatever their replacement is? And if you consider it in those terms, like, okay, well, that unit is going to have its own weaknesses. That unit is going to have its own strengths. It's going to be serving a maybe similar combat role, maybe a different one, like in the case of the Cyprian versus Cohort. Like, now the Nidus Trinity can do different things with its bio than it could before. And it also can't do certain things that a default Terran can do, or a Terran that doesn't have the Cyprian removed. And I think that's a pretty big deal, because it actually does mean that we're still designing the races with competitive mindsets in play. We're designing the factions with these competitive mindsets, these paradigms that stress the interaction concepts, that stress the idea that, hey, dude, you need to specifically like play to your race and now faction's strengths. And what does that mean broadly speaking? Like, is there a world where these factions could somehow be, competitive and compelling in a more competitive context and wouldn't be totally unbalanced? Well, I would hope that they wouldn't be unbalanced. The point is to design them such that they have trade-offs. And the reason why we avoid them in multiplayer is mostly because of the information burden, and also because good luck actually implementing a system where you can like scout for your faction or whatever. But maybe there could even be an angle. This is the other thing. And so like the final and main criticism that on some level I agree with, and on other levels I don't really think is that big of a deal, is the concept that, hey, dude, the races are going to be different in single player to multiplayer. And so maybe you form a really big attachment with playing as the Golden Republic, but you can't actually do that in multiplayer because, well, it doesn't exist in multiplayer. And at the same time, maybe the inverse is true, where you deliberately avoid playing a certain campaign or race or whatever because of some factional difference that, like removes one of your favorite units or whatever. Now, Really, in both of those cases, I would say get used to it, bro, because like you can't play a Zerg when you're playing as Terran. So if you really like a Zerg unit, then well, you're shit out of luck, bro, because it doesn't exist for Terrans. And it's kind of like part of the point of the game, especially with such a huge unit count, is to explore the tech tree and use a lot of different things, and not just like say, oh, I really like this one thing or whatever. That definitely feels like an overreaction in many ways, but beyond that, like there is a glimmer of truth to that I can agree with, which is, if I do get used to using all of these tools in a multiplayer context and then I pivot to single player, or vice versa, where I get used to, well, I don't get used to the default Terran tech tree because, maybe there's all of these factions and maybe I don't, you play as the default one too often or whatever. Like if that's going to be the case, if that does end up happening, then okay, well, there's definitely going to be a distinction. There's going to be this, adjustment time. And on the one hand, the reason I don't care that much is there's always going to be an adjustment time. You're dealing with a case where, the game is completely different in the context of playing versus a human than it is playing versus an AI, and playing on a standardized, competitive, melee, balanced map, TM, whatever that means, compared to a much more open, free-for-all type map or what have you. There's going to be differences depending on your team composition. You're going to have to communicate differently. You're going to have to do all these things differently, if assuming you're even playing a team game to begin with. And all of that is a pretty big deal. Like these are all huge differences. But on the other hand, you can also make the argument, why make more differences for the player to learn? Why make it even more of a distinction? I still think that the campaigns content, and the reason why I stressed this so much at the beginning, I still think that all of the content that we release will still push players to be competitive, such that even the players who don't want to play versus humans, that don't want to play, like they've got ladder anxiety or whatever, like this is a real thing that a lot of people have. And okay, if you don't like that part, if you don't like the social part or whatever, then ideally you'd be able to still get a really significant education about how to play the game and how to play an RTS well in general. And you'd be able to get that through the single player content and the cooperative content. Currently, there's nothing for those people. There is actually zero things for those people if they want to get a good experience playing an RTS and learn in the process and improve in the process. They can do pretty much nothing. They can play CMBW versus AI. That's what they can do right now, and some of the other scenarios. And maybe there's like Age of Empires shit that I'm not aware of, but all the campaigns seem really bad, so probably not. I think there's really a significant lack of that. And so I'm not saying that they should just take what they can get. I mean, by virtue of the campaigns and other content being competitive, we already bridge the gap between competitive, like multiplayer PvP and the single player stuff, because both of them are about competing. Both of them are about trying to overcome a challenge and defeat your opponent. And you don't get that most of the time because you don't really have a real opponent most of the time in single player. So that's a huge difference already. And I think that's more than enough to give us the leeway we need to have very different maps, very different team situations, having, AI show up in the middle of the game, and instead of it being a spawned in attack wave or whatever, it's actually a spawned in player that starts to establish a base that you can choose to like dedicate resources to snipe, but then maybe your army's out of position. So you have to start thinking about that. Like, oh, how does that actually change the calculus? And can I like actually manage all of this stuff? Like that's going to be a very different thing. You're never going to see that in a multiplayer game. You're never going to see that in a PvP game, so far as we know right now, right? That's definitely not going to be like a drop-in thing or whatever. Like maybe there has been talk about like buying back your ally or whatever, but I'm not really so sure that it makes that much sense in most of the cases. I can't really think of cases where it would be super useful very commonly. So, and it's very expensive to try to like time-wise to try to spend resources on exploring something like that, the R&D part. So anyhow, all that to say, I think it's really neat to explore this sort of conceptual framework for things. I think it's really neat to try to bridge the gap competitively between PvP and PvAI, or PvE as it is. And I think if you do that, then it doesn't much matter how many differences there are between the modes, even though I do think you could maybe find a way to make this framework work inside competitive PvP. It's just a matter of, okay, if you can do it, then it probably has to be something that you do in the middle of the game. And the difference between single player and, PvP is that you just have it by default. And so you are the Golden Republic already in the campaigns. But in multiplayer, the story you're telling is, hey, you're this like upstart new faction or faction unto yourself or whatever. And you somehow like court the other factions or like a specific faction that you select somehow in the game by doing something specifically. That would probably be something I would be more interested in exploring rather than picking, your race and then your faction in the main menu or whatever. Although you could do that as well, I guess, in the lobby. You could choose to do that if you wanted to. But I'm not so sure. I mean, that adds a lot of stuff that we probably can't. I mean, we can't even really add shit to the menu anyway in Brood War, not very easily. But if we were to do something like that, okay, that's a thing we could maybe try to do. It's just, to me, I feel like that might be a bit of a misread. That being said, in the example yesterday when I was explaining the system, I did give the context that, hey, it's really neat to have something like a... Command & Conquer 3 had this in their multiplayer where they basically had, in the expansion pack, they had a bunch of, I think they had 3 sub-factions, and each sub-faction really only changed probably 3 things. I think it was like upgrades and units and stuff. Kind of like what Brood War did to the default factions, but there was like a couple of different choices you could do, right? So Brood War did the Valkyrie, the Goliath, Goliath range upgrade, and the medic. And these are huge changes, obviously, because they're just adding stuff. I think maybe the CNC3 stuff actually replaced things. If I remember correctly, they did that. Now, some of their choices were really baffling. I believe one of them really tried to stress the flamethrower infantry, and so they basically made them fucking impenetrable to damage. So that was really messed up. But generally speaking, I think the main thing that I would look at is saying that really just pay attention to what you're adding and make sure that you're, somewhat cautious about that. And if you do decide that everything is, balanced enough and whatever, then maybe you can go for that in competitive. But I just would like to, I kind of think there's already a huge distinction between competitive and like PvP and the hopefully competitive, ideally competitive PvE, that you're not really in a spot, I don't think, where I don't think that it makes sense to try to bridge that gap. That's the main thing right now is we would have to bridge so many other things that are actually more impactful than what I believe the faction system will be. That is it really worth it? Like the maps being so different that's a huge change, and that's much more of an impact than, oh, here's my, different unit instead of a Goliath or different unit instead of a Cyprian. That makes a huge difference. That makes way more of a difference because the maps affect all matchups. They affect every run of the game. And so that's something that, I think maybe the reason why factions would get heat for this sort of thing is because they're kind of new to our conception. They're new to CMBW, but maps, on the other hand, are not new at all. So in short, we have covered a number of topics here when we're trying to get factional, trying to see what we can do with the riffing of different concepts and ideas. I guess I can talk at this point that I actually don't know if, I don't think our first game is going to have factions. I don't think, Cosmonarchy Retail will necessarily have factions because, I guess I just don't know yet, but the fact that they have so many different units, because you have more units in that plan than you do in CMBW, you actually have a little bit more liberty to think, okay, if I'm this faction, then I can, express my, character or whatever through that. And you have to build the assumption into the campaign that the player would be doing exactly the same. So even if they're part of some, particular alliance of Ansifi that prefers to use fire-based units or whatever, like maybe the reason they do that is because they're often fighting Keltar, and flame-based attacks scare the shit out of Keltar, so ends up being more effective. So like that would be one in particular example, very specific, but if you can kind of conceptually like wrap your head around that conceptually, and then the player themselves decides, well, I don't really like fire-based attacks for whatever reason. I prefer to express my personality a different way. Then that would be allowed. Like the story would assume that, hey, you would actually be doing that a little bit anyway. So hopefully that makes some degree of sense to people as an example. It's like, then it's not like I'm playing as the Golden Republic and I train cohorts, which is, we did have that a while back. It's like that was a possibility. I even had a dialogue line in the scenario map that the screenshot is taken from that was basically saying like the commander was really angry that his aide had allowed him to build cohorts or whatever. Basically, like his aide didn't send those schematics to the scrapyard and what have you. So like that's obviously way back, back when Scrapyard was a production structure instead of an add-on. So you can really see what I'm talking about here when I'm talking about how much things are different, how much things have evolved. But I do think anyway that all of this being said, it's like a pretty neat idea. It's a pretty important concept. It's something that I think personally, has a lot of merit and can be explored. Yeah, people are going to say, "Oh, it's too much of a like a information burden." Yeah, it's too much stuff that's different than multiplayer. But if they're going to be like that about the faction stuff, especially considering it's planned to be so small in terms of impact, in terms of number of units replaced, then they have to be consistent with that, and they have to start, demanding that we have maps that are the same as the campaign maps, or vice versa, that campaign maps become symmetrical balanced maps. And that campaign maps either never or either campaign maps never have PvAI with like different teams, or melee PvP has different teams and stuff. Like that doesn't make any fucking sense, right? So, like, there's so many things that you have to be like that are way more impactful, is my case, than a couple of units being different. Because, the team thing, okay, that affects all players, not just the player who's picked this particular race and or playing the campaign where they're this particular faction. And the idea behind, oh, here's my fucking, I don't know, like, there's so many different cases where it feels to me like it could be a lot better if we allowed things like maybe asymmetric maps in multiplayer and like try to explore that, but still with the idea being that the maps were fair. It's just that you had different tools. So like you can still win in any matchup, but if you're Zerg in the top spawn, then you have different tools than the Protoss does in the bottom spawn or whatever. And like, or even if you're Zerg in either spawn, you just have different tools, but you can still win. Like that's sort of my thinking, is like, we could actually push maps to be a little bit more like the campaigns. It's just we have to design them for all races to work in all matchups, and that definitely prohibits the kinds of things that we can do. So, yeah, anyway, I think this has a lot of merit. This has a lot of potential, and there are going to be people who prefer the fact that, like, hitherto all of the races have been identical in single player and multiplayer. This would obviously go out the window as second we decided to start disabling tech in campaigns. If we say disable tier 3 in the first mission of a campaign or something to that effect, which, could happen, but not sure if it would. Still on the fence about that. If we were going to do something like that, then that would obviously change the calculus quite a bit, and you'd already have that thrown out the window. And you can maybe say, well, that's like removing a choice and it's only in one mission, but you don't know how many missions you're going to play as a specific faction. It could also be only in one mission. So the argumentation falls flat because it fails to be consistent, in my opinion. And we'll talk about that with Veek on the next episode of Crow's Nest, assuming he's got a different opinion. I assume he's thought the argument better, more fully thought through and stuff than what I'm saying, because I don't have that view or opinion. So it's hard for me to just come up with something on the spot that actually works for that particular case. But that being said, that concludes this episode of Prototype. We're getting factional, boys. We're going to have a bunch of crazy shit happen in some of the campaign missions, and these scenarios will, of course, be the way for me to explore that in a subtler way. This first mission is just a 1v1, so it starts off with you fighting against some Zerg. They are not going to have cohorts, that's just for the screenshot, but you will have aspirants and a couple of other units that are Golden Republic, so that'll be a dry run for the concept, and we'll see how it works out. And you can join me for mapping and other things on stream, of course, and you can join the Discord server to get in on the action and get in on the discussion, and of course you can join our coffee to give us money so that we can do this more often. And that's it. Peace.